Okay. So today's daf is Mem. We left off at the top of Mem. We left off approximately for the fourth line. Really, we're starting the fourth line where it says Itmar Chamin Shochmu Erev Shabbat. So we've been discussing issues of water heated before Shabbat and the permissibility of bathing in it or using it for different purposes. So so according to Rav, if you have water that was heated before Shabbat, now obviously you can't heat water on Shabbat, and if it is heated even by an automatic process on Shabbat, it's problematic. But if it was heated before Shabbat, he says you can wash your body, but only one limb at a time. So you can't get into the bath, let's say, but you can wash one limb at a time. That's what Rav says. According to Shmuel, the only thing you're allowed to do is clean your face, your feet, and your hands, but you cannot clean your entire body, according to Shmuel. There is an objection. So it says in a Baraita very explicitly against the teaching of Rav, because it says you can wash your face, feet, and hands, but you can't wash your entire body. Tiyuvta de Rav. This would appear to be a clear refutation of Rav. You can't get clearer than that. So Amar lach Rav says Lo kol gufo bevat achat ela ever. What it means when it says you can't wash your whole body is you can't wash your whole body at once, but you can wash it one limb at a time. So then the Gemara asks, what do you mean? Va'panav yadav v'raglav katane. But it says you can only wash your face, feet, and hands. How could that mean that you're allowed to wash your entire body one limb at a time? It says face, feet, and hands. He says, Ke'en panav yadav v'raglav. What it means to say is, like your face, feet, and hands. In other words, the same way that you wash your face, your feet, and your hands one part at a time. You can't. You would be quite talented if you were able to wash your feet and your face at the same time. I can't really imagine doing that. So if you could, so you obviously have to do them one at a time. So too, you can wash your limbs one at a time, according to Rav, but not your entire body at once. The difference between, of course, Shmuel is saying you're only allowed to wash your face, feet, and hands. So his understanding fits perfectly with that Baraita. Tashma, another Baraita, lo itiru lirchotz v'chamin shuchmu erev Shabbat ela panav yadav raglav. Again, there's another Baraita that says explicitly the only thing you're allowed to wash is your face, feet, and hands. So what is Rav going to do with that? He says hachinami also here, or hachanami also there. Also in this case, rather, ke'en panav yadav raglav. It means like your face, feet, and hands. Just like your face, feet, and hands are done one at a time. So too, you can wash really any limb one part at a time, just not all together. Tanya Kivatei de Shmuel. Then there's another Baraita that supports Shmuel. Chamin shuchmu me'erev Shabbat nemachar rochetz ben panav yadav raglav aval lo kol gufo ever. That's explicitly against Rav. That it says, what can you do with water that was heated before Shabbat? You can wash your face, feet, and hands, but you cannot wash your entire body one limb at a time, like Rav says. And it's certainly the same for water that was heated before Yom Tov, that you're allowed to wash your face, feet, and hands, for sure. But you're not allowed to wash your entire body one limb at a time. That is a direct contradiction to Rav and a direct support for the position of Shmuel. According to Rabbah, the teaching was slightly different. It was as follows. That instead of saying you can wash your entire body one limb at a time, Rabbah's teaching was that what Rav said was you can wash your entire body except for one limb. So for example, you can wash your entire body and then say, I'm just not going to wash this arm. The rest of my body I can wash, but not one arm. Or one foot, or whatever. So one part of your body you have to leave out, the rest of the body can go in. It's hard to do. But so that's the way that Rav wants to interpret it. Everything was okay. It fit. Okay, thank you. So everything that so that's the way. So that's different, because before he said you can actually wash your entire body. It's just that the method has to be different. It has to be one limb at a time. Now he says you wash your entire body. You just leave one limb out of the bath, and that way you don't wash the entire body. Now again, we're going to have a problem. Tiyuvta. All of these same sources that refuted the previous teaching of Rav will also refute this one, because they all say that you're only allowed to wash your face, feet, and hands, and now it's even worse, because now Rav is not even saying that you're supposed to go limb by limb. Before he could explain face, feet, and hands by saying, well, that's because it means limb by limb. but now he's not saying limb by limb. He's saying the entire body can get in the water except for one limb. So that definitely doesn't square with the sources before that said you're only allowed to wash your face, feet, and hands. So that's a refutation. Amar le Rav Yosef le Rabbaye. Rav Yosef said to Abaye, Rabba mika avid kishmate de Rav. In this respect, now remember, Abaye grew up in the house of Rabba bar Nachmani. So therefore, he knew all of the practices of Rabbah, and in general, as a rule, Rabbah followed the teachings of Rav. So Rav Yosef was the teacher of Abaye, and he knew that Abaye grew up in the house of Rabbah. So he said to him, "Hey, Abaye, I wanted to know, did Rabbah follow this teaching of Rav and actually take a bath in water that was heated before Shabbat, not putting one of his limbs in the bath, like holding his arm up or whatever, and washing the rest of his body? Did he actually follow that?" And Abaye said, "Amar le lo yadana, I have no idea." But what was the question? Pshita de lo avid deha itutav. How could you even suggest that Rabbah would follow the teaching of Rav when we just saw that the teaching of Rav was contradicted and refuted? Why would he follow a refuted opinion? Answer, lo shemiyale, because obviously up till the time that he reported the teaching, he hadn't heard the refutation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have reported it. So the question is, when he believed in the teaching, when he believed it was accurate, before he knew about the braitot that contradicted it, did he follow it? But wait a second. If he didn't know that it was refuted, he certainly must have followed it. Why? Because Abai said, "Kol milei demar Ravid kerav, bar menetlat, David kishmuel." There were only 3 things where Rabbah did not follow Rav. In everything, Rabbah followed Rav against Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel were always arguing. Okay? There were only 3 things that he didn't follow Rav. What were they? We learned earlier in the Masekhet that there's a machloka between Rav and Shmuel on 3 items. Can you take tzitzit from one garment and put them on another? Can you take the fire from one candle of the Chanukah candle and transfer it to another? And the other one was, do we follow Rabbi Shimon? Do we follow the teaching of Rabbi Shimon with regard to dragging a chair on the ground on Shabbat? Do we have to not drag chairs on the ground because we're worried that they'll make holes in the ground? That was the question. Right, so in all of those cases, Rav was lenient, and Shmuel was, or wait a second, actually. In all of those cases, Shmuel, he followed Shmuel in leniencies. Okay, Shmuel was lenient in all of these cases, and Rav was stringent. And in all of these 3 cases, he followed the leniencies of Shmuel. So he allowed you to transfer tzitzit from one garment to a new garment, and to transfer fire from one candle to another, and to drag a chair on the ground, even though it might make a hole in the ground, which is according to Rabbi Shimon, who says, Davar she'eino mitkaven, if you're not intending to make a hole in the ground, it's okay. So in these 3 things, he followed Shmuel. But that implies that in all other things, he followed Rav. So Rabbah followed Rav in everything but 3 things. So that means that he must have followed him about showering or bathing on Shabbat, right? There's no reason to think otherwise. So why is Abaye not sure what he did? It should be obvious. Yeah, of course, he always followed Rav. So what's the answer? That when we said that he always followed Rav, we said ki chumrei de Rav avid, ki kulei de Rav lo avid. We meant that generally he followed the stringencies of Rav. But this is a leniency of Rav. Because in this case, Shmuel is saying you can't take a bath on Shabbat and leave one limb out of the bath. You can only wash your face, feet, and hands with warm water. That's it. And so really Shmuel is being stringent here, and Rav is being lenient. And we know that there are only 3 cases where Rabbah deviated from the teachings of Rav, and those 3 cases he went like the lenient teachings of Shmuel. But we don't have any evidence of any other cases where Rabbah went with the lenient view. Maybe in other cases of machloka between Rav and Shmuel, he followed the stringent view, even when it was Shmuel's view. Okay, so therefore we don't know what he actually did here, if he actually followed Rav in taking a bath on Shabbat. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Merchat shepakaku nikavav me'erev Shabbat. What this is talking about is that they would have a merchat, they would have a bathhouse, and there was a flame under the bathhouse, and the flame would heat the water. And what they would do was they would plug up the holes. Imagine the flame is underneath the floor, and there were holes that allowed the heat from the flame to heat the water. They're on 2 different levels. So if you plug up those holes, not very much heat is going to penetrate and heat the water, is it? Not very much. So if they plug up the holes, before Shabbat. So then, what it says is, Lemotzei Shabbat rochetz bo miyad. You can go in immediately after Shabbat and use the water because you don't have to be concerned that it was actually heated over Shabbat. It wasn't heated over Shabbat. Because we know that they plugged up the holes. Similarly on Yom Tov, you can go in to the sauna. They would have different things. They would have a bathhouse where you would actually go in the water, like the, what do you call that, the jacuzzi or something, right? And then it's the sweating room is the sauna, right? That's what they call it. I haven't been in one, so I remember the terms from when I used to go to the JCC back when I was a kid, and I remember they had that. All right, the steam room. Okay, so which is the sauna? The dry heat, right? Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure whether this was steam or dry heat, but whatever it is, it was some kind of sweating room. Okay, so you were allowed to do that. Now Tosafot points out that really you were allowed to do that in the beginning, both on Shabbat and Yom Tov. It's not specifying only Yom Tov for any halachic reason. Okay, in the end, none of it was permitted either on Shabbat or Yom Tov, but we're going to see how that developed. So in the beginning, it said as long as they plugged the holes, so they weren't heating the water on Shabbat or on Yom Tov for bathing purposes. You were allowed to go into to sweat in the sweating room, and you were allowed to go and wash in cold water afterwards, because that's what you would do. You would be all sweaty, you would want to wash in cold water, not in hot water. So that's what they would do in the old days. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Masekhet Shabbat Daf. There was a story in Bnei Brak that they plugged the holes of the merchatz, of the bathhouse, on Erev Shabbat. And on Erev Yom Tov rather. And the next day, Lemachar Nechnas Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva ve'eziyubo. And the next day, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva went, and they went in the sweat room. V'yatz'u v'nishtatfu b'vet achitzon, and then they went and had a cold shower outside. Ela shechamin shelo mechufin v'nesarim. But what they would do was two things. Not only did they plug the holes that were where the heat would come up from below, they also put boards over the actual bath, because they didn't want people to go into the bath. In other words, not only did they not allow the bath to be heated on Shabbat or Yom Tov, they actually covered it over with boards so nobody went in. So you could only do sweating, and then you could pour water over yourself, but you couldn't go into the bath at all. That was how they had it structured. Okay? So the rabbi said, when this matter came before the Chachamim, they said, actually, you don't even need the bath to be covered with boards. As long as the heating area is plugged up, so the heat is not coming up to heat the bath, we're not worried that you're going to jump into the bath, into the cold water on Shabbat anyway, or on Yom Tov. So you don't need to cover it with boards. However, but when many sinners came, then they started to prohibit. They started to prohibit. In other words, they started to prohibit them from going into the bathhouse unless they covered the bath with boards, to make clear that you weren't allowed to go into the bath on Shabbat and Yom Tov. In the beginning they weren't worried, later on they were. We're going to see how this developed in a second. The really huge bathhouses, you're allowed to go in and you don't have to worry. What that means is, not that you're allowed to go into the bathhouse to bathe, but at a certain point they prohibited sweating also. They prohibited all of it. Alright, they prohibited you to go in even for the sweat room.
On Shabbat.
Right, because many people would sin. We're going to see how it developed. It was an evolution of the prohibition. So when they said hitchilu lasor, they started to prohibit. It means they prohibited everything. We're going to see why. But the point is that you couldn't go into the sweat room, but you could walk through. They had these enormous bathhouses, and let's say the best shortcut between one place and another was walking through the bathhouse. Okay, so you were allowed to walk through even though it's warm in there and the non-Jews are using it. And because it's so large, you're not really going to get the effects of going into the bathhouse on Shabbat. So it's okay. If it were very small, where walking through is basically the same as going into the sweat room, you wouldn't be allowed to. Now we're going to see how this developed. So my Ovrei Avera. What is the story of these Ovrei Avera? What are these sinners doing? Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Yehoshua ben Levi. That Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi said that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, Mishum bar kapara, in the name of bar kapara. But in the beginning, believe it or not, they allowed you to go to the bathhouse and even go into the bath, as long as the water was heated before Shabbat, no problem. The problem was that sometimes the water would become too cold. And what happened? The bathhouse owner said, Oy vey, my parnasa, what am I going to do? People are going to show up, the bath is going to be cold, and then I'm going to lose my business. Because obviously they would pay before Shabbat or after Shabbat, but that wasn't the point. If he didn't have hot water, it would be like, the restaurant owner who runs out of meat and says, I'd better run to the treif supermarket and put some meat, otherwise nobody's going to eat my food. I'm not going to be able to serve my customers. So they started to heat the water on Shabbat because they got nervous. So then the rabbi said, okay, of course they pretended that they had heated it before Shabbat. Oh yeah, of course we heated it before Shabbat. But really they were playing with it on Shabbat because it was becoming too cold and they wanted to provide good stuff for their customers. So so they said, you know what, you can't go into the water at all because it's too tempting for the proprietor that he's going to want to heat the water. But they said you could still go in and sweat in there on Shabbat. You just can't go into the water because going into the water, that really requires it to be warm enough that it's comfortable. So, so then they would go in and they would actually go into the bath, which they weren't allowed to do, and then come out and say, oh yeah, we were just sweating in the sweat. We didn't go in the bath. They would be lying. So they said, okay, fine. They had to prohibit even going into the sweat room, the sauna or whatever, because people would pretend that they had gone in just to sweat, but really they were going into the bathhouse. Because remember, after they would go into the sweat room, they would wash off with cold water in the outside room. So you would come out wet either way. Why did they do it in the outside room? So it was clear that you weren't going in, so that it was clear that inside you were just doing the steam, or you were using the sweating room. Okay? But then you would come out into another room and wash off with cold water, so it was clear that you weren't wet because of the hot water inside, in the inner room. But once you leave the bathhouse, nobody can really tell. You just look wet. So you say, oh yeah, I was just sweating and I washed up with cold water. No, you weren't. You were in the warm water. You weren't supposed to. So they had to prohibit the sweating too. So then what happened? That they allowed, though, they said, you know what though, we're going to give you a break because you need to bathe. So we're going to let you go into the Chamet Tiveria. You can go into the springs of Tiveria. Now it happens to be that the Chamet Tiveria are not the most pleasant place to bathe. Number one, they're very hot, and number two, they're smelly because they have all that sulfur and everything. They don't smell good. You're going to come out smelling not appealing, and nobody's going to want to hug you or kiss you when you come out. So they would come. What happened? That they would or they would go into the bathhouse and take a normal bath and then say, oh yeah, but they would say, we bathed in the Chamet Tiveria. So they would pretend like they were. Now this is obviously not everybody. The point is that it was a significant enough group of people doing this, bending the rules, that they had to step in and do something. It doesn't mean everybody was bad. It's just saying a significant minority was bending the rules. So because of that, they ruined it for everybody.
These thermal hot springs are all over New Zealand.
Oh really?
Everywhere. I mean, it's like the big thing to do.
Do they smell bad too?
They have that.
They have that sulfur smell. Yeah. So
I don't think the smell stays in you. It evaporates.
Yeah, I'm sure it eventually does. Yeah, but people didn't enjoy the experience, I guess, as much. Yeah. So what happened that? So eventually they said, you know what? You can't do any hot bathing. Just cold water. That's it. See, these are wise rabbis, not the rabbis of today that keep making rules and make impossible rules that nobody can follow. Like, oh, you can't have an iPhone and you can't have an internet and you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't go to a concert. And then they expect everybody to actually follow the rules, but it's impossible to follow all the rules that they make. These rabbis said, you know what? It's impossible. The people can't follow this to not have a warm bath. So they said, they retracted and they said, you know what? You can use the Chamet Tiveria. You could use the hot springs. However, but they left the other gezerot in place, and they didn't allow you to go to the sauna or to go to the bathhouse. They only allowed you to go to the hot springs of Tiberia.
Isn't the problem with drying?
That's another separate problem. Right now they're dealing only with the water issue of heating the water. But yeah, there's another issue with sechitas, squeezing out when dry and stuff like that. That's true. That is also an issue, but a separate one. Amar Rava says, Hayman da avar ad Rabbanan shay the mekrele avar yana. You see from this Mishnah or these Braitot that we just read that somebody who violates even a rabbinic commandment, we can call him avaryan. We can call him a sinner. How do you know that? Kiman ki haitana, because we just saw it said mishirabu ovre avera. As we turn to the second amud, it said before when the ovre avera, when the sinners became numerous, they had to make more gezerot. What was the sin that they did? They went into a bath on Shabbat. Is going into a preheated bath on Shabbat a sin? It was a rabbinic institution. As long as you didn't heat the water on Shabbat, it was really okay. They weren't allowed to go in. And they went in, and it was a rabbinic decree, and yet they were called ovrei avera. They were called sinners, even though all they were violating was a rabbinic commandment. Now, obviously, that means somebody who habitually violates the rabbinic commandment. It doesn't mean somebody who does it once is called a sinner. Now, we said before that you can walk through the very large and spacious bathhouses of the cities, and it's not a problem. It's not considered as going into the sweating room to do that. That's true about the large cities, but not those in the villages. What's the reason? Because since it's very small, it's so hot in there that it's like going into the steam room. It's no different. You'll just make an excuse. I want to take a shortcut, but really you're going in to, it would be like if you went into the perfume shop in order to smell really good, and you hung around there for a while or something like that. It's cheating. A person can stand next to the medura. Medura is a fireplace. And then after heating up, he can go wash off in cold water because he gets sweaty from that. But what he can't do is, he cannot go wash in cold water and then stand next to the fire. Why not? Because if he does that, because he's going to heat the water that's on him. In other words, if you go into the water and then you stand next to the fire, you're going to cook the water that's on you if you're standing close enough. So that's why you can't do it that way. The Rabbi said, a person can take a rag. This is like a hot compress, basically. He takes a rag or some kind of a towel and heat it, and he can put bishabat, and he can put it on his stomach on Shabbat. In other words, he's having a stomach ache and he wants like a heating pad. So this is the version of a heating pad. You would put the towel or the cloth on the hot water, the urn, basically the urn. It would heat up, and they put it on your stomach, and that would soothe the pain. You can't bring the kumus itself. The kumus is actually the urn itself. You don't bring that. Now they didn't have urns like we have that are electric, obviously, so they would take it off of the heat, off of the fire. Don't take that and put it on your stomach. Even during the week, you don't take a hot pot and put it on your stomach. It's dangerous. Okay. Now the Rishonim give other reasons why it's also a violation of Shabbat potentially, either because you could end up spilling water on your clothes and then they'll be squeezed out, or because of whatever. Rashi says because if it spills on you, it's washing with hot water. There's lots of other possible reasons why it would be prohibited on Shabbat. But the simple reading of the Gemara is that it's saying not to do it any time. Okay, because it's just a dangerous thing to do and not a good idea. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. You can bring cold water and put it near the fire, not to heat the water, but just so that you take off the chill. If it's freezing cold and you want to take off the chill, you can put it near the water. Now, I'm near the fire. Now, there's a machloket rishonim. Does that mean you have to keep it a certain distance from the fire? It has to be far enough away from the fire that even if you left it there all day, it wouldn't heat up? Or does it mean that you can actually bring it close to the fire? You just have to be vigilant to remove it before it gets too warm. This is a machloket rishonim. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Mevia isha pach shel shemen." So similarly, a woman can bring oil. They would use the oil to rub on their body, and it's nice to have warm oil rubbed on your body, not cold oil. So they would bring it to be warmed by the fire. It's okay, not that it be cooked, but shifasher, that it take away some of the coldness of the oil in a similar way by bringing it close to the fire. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer isha sacha yada shemen. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is a little more conservative here. He says you can't bring the jar of oil near the fire, but you know what you could do? You can put oil on your hand and hold your hands near the fire, and then go over to your child and rub it on them, because I guess they would rub it on the skin of their children as like a moisturizer. They asked a question. Now notice that the Tanakama didn't mention anything about oil. He only mentioned water. And Rabbi Yehuda didn't mention anything about water, neither did Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. They only talked about oil. So what does each one hold about the other case? What is the Tanakama who said that you can bring water close to the fire just to take the chill off? Would he say the same about oil or not? So Rabbav Rav Yosef Damri Tarvayu, Rabban Rav Yosef said Lehetera. He would permit that as well. Just like you can bring water close to the fire in order to remove the chill, you could do the same with oil. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Li Yisura. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, no, you can't do it. He allows water but doesn't allow oil. Rabav Rav Yosef Namar Tarvayu leheter shemen afal pisha yad soledet bo mutar kasavar Tanakama shemen en bo mishum bishul. That this is how they read the Mishnah. That the Tanakama is saying you can bring water close to the fire, only to remove the chill, but you can't let the water get hot, because letting the water get hot is cooking it. But oil, the Tanakama says, you can even allow the oil to become hot.
What about the problem of smoothing?
What's smoothing? It's oil. It's olive oil. It's not so we're assuming it's thin. Yeah, we're assuming it's thin. Yeah. So what's the reason of the Tanakama? Because he says that shemen bishul doesn't apply to shemen. It's just a fruit. It's oil. It's olive oil. So what? So water, if it heats up to yad soledet bo, to the amount of heat that your hand recoils from it. Let's say it's 120 degrees or whatever, 130 degrees. So if they put the water close by, that's cooking the water, if it heats up. But oil, the Tanakama would say you can heat it up as much as you want. That's why he doesn't mention oil, because he's lenient. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no. That Rabbi Yehuda says that you can bring oil close to the fire, right? But you can't let it get hot to the level of yad soledet bo. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying that it is subject to the prohibition of cooking. You can't let it get 130 degrees, but you can take the chill off of it. That's not considered cooking it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel lememar shemen yesh bo mishum bishul ve'efshero zeu bishulo. That not only is oil subject to cooking, but even taking the chill off of oil is rabbinically prohibited as cooking. And therefore the only way you could do it is indirectly by putting the oil on your hand and standing close to the fire. But you can't put the jar of oil close to the fire. That's one would think so, yeah. I would think so. Yeah.
Here is I think yad soledet bo versus the definition of what is cooking. Because we think cooking as the boiling point of water is 100 degrees C. Oil, the boiling point of oil is very, very much higher.
Right.
But that's not the issue. The issue is solidity.
Right. The issue is not right. And the question is whether oil follows the same rule as water or not. Basically, they say oil and water don't mix. But okay. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Lisra. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak reads this exactly the opposite way. Okay. So the Tanakama that only talked about water is because he prohibits oil, not because he permits. Okay. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak comes along and says, no, leisura shem and afal b'she'ena yad soledet b'asur. Kasavar shemen yesh bo mishum bishul ve'efshero zeu bishulo. He says that I'm even more strict about oil. Not that I'm more lenient, the Tanakama says, but I'm more strict. I said that even to take the chill off of oil, you're not allowed to do. V'atar Rabbi Yehuda lememar hefshero zeu bishulo, and Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient and says that taking the chill off is allowed, but cooking it is also not allowed. So, and similarly, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that you can't even take the chill off of oil. So therefore, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel hainu Tanakama. That would sound like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the Tanakama are the same, because the Tanakama says you can't even take the chill off of oil. That's why he didn't mention it. Rabbi Yehuda says you can take the chill off. You just can't let it get hotter than you just can't let it get hot like you would not let water get hot.
Wait.
But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is agreeing with the Tanakama then.
How would you take the chill off?
By holding it for a shorter time. Yeah. So Tanakama. So Hainu Tanakama. Ika benayu kil achar yad. What's the difference? That the Tanakama would say not only can you not bring oil close to the fire because heating it even a little bit, even taking the chill off is a problem. But he says you can't even do it with subterfuge. You can't even wipe it on your hands and stand near the fire. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying a leniency. That you can actually put it on your hands and stand by the fire and do it indirectly. That you're allowed to do. So this is a machloket, Tanaim, and a machloket in understanding the Mishnah here, or understanding the three Tanaim here, the three opinions that are expressed in the Braita here. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda says Amar Shmuel, Echad shemen ve'echad mayim, yad soledet bo asur, and yad soledet bo mutar. Whether it's oil or water, when it becomes heated to the level that one's hand would recoil, that is cooking, and when it doesn't, it's okay. What does it mean, yad soledet bo? Amar Rahava, kol shekreso shel tinok nichvet, that anything that would cause the stomach of a baby to be burned. Okay, so that's because the stomach of a baby is a sensitive place on the body. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, I once followed Rabbi, meaning Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, to the bathhouse. I wanted to take the oil because they would rub massage oil, I guess, on their skin after the bath. It was a moisturizer. He wanted to take the oil and put it into the bath for a little while in order to heat it. Now, this is obviously before the gezerah, that they couldn't go into hot baths, because they're going into a hot bath here. So he wanted to put, now we're going to see that the Gemara is going to say it was during the time when Chamei Tiveria it's talking about Chamei Tiveria. But whatever the case may be.
Warm it or to make it into a liquid?
No, he wanted to warm it. He wanted to take off the chill so he could use it. So Va'amar li, he said to me, Tol beklisheni. Take it in a klisheni. Take it in a second vessel. What that means is, we know a klisheni is when kli rishon is the vessel that's over the fire. Once you take, let's say you have an urn. An urn is considered over the fire because it has a heating element. That's kli rishon. You take from that into a cup of water. You take a cup of water, a mug, and you pour the water into the mug. That's klisheni. Okay, so he said take klisheni. And v'ten. So he said, take a kli sheni and put the oil into the kli sheni. Don't put it directly into the kli rishon, because the ambati itself, the actual bath water, was a kli rishon. It was heated directly over the fire. So he said, don't put the oil directly in there. And actually, this sugya is very, very important. This piece of Gemara is very important in Yoreh De'ah when they talk about Kli Sheni and Kli Rishon, and the Taz brings this Gemara to, and it's brought in the discussions of Hilchot Kashrut, because there's also a lot of relevance to Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni.
Drop the Kli Sheni into the Kli Rishon.
Right,
then it becomes a Kli Rishon.
That's what he talks about over there. That's one of the things that he brings from there. Yeah. So Shema Mina, come listen. We can learn from here three things. Tlat Shema Mina Shemen Yesh Mishum Bishul. You see that Rabbi held that oil is subject to cooking because he didn't want him to put it into the ambati. V'shma mina kli sheni eno mivashel. You also see that a kli sheni is okay, because he said if you take it into a new vessel rather than putting it into the first vessel, it's okay. And you see that even taking off the chill is considered cooking, because if taking off the chill wasn't considered cooking, he could have told him put it in there for 1 second and take it out. But he said, no, don't put it in at all. So even taking off the chill is rabbinically prohibited. That's why he said, you can only do it in a kli sheni, in a second vessel. But how could he do this at all? You're allowed to think about divrei Torah in any place but a bathhouse and a bathroom. They're dirty, because people are unclothed in the bathhouse, and people are doing, and a bet kisei, a bathroom is not clean. So how could he discuss halacha? He's telling him, put it in a kli sheni. He's teaching him halachot in the bathhouse. How could he do that? Maybe he'll tell me that he spoke to him in Yiddish. No, he spoke to him he didn't speak to him in Lashon Kodesh. He didn't speak to him in Hebrew. So maybe it was Greek. He told him in Greek or Aramaic. Okay, Amar Abaye says Devarim shel chol mutar la'omran b'lashon kodesh, because Abaye said that things that are secular, you can say them in Hebrew. Shel kodesh asur la'omran b'lashon chol. But holy things you can't say even in a regular language. In other words, it's the content, not the language. So don't think because I'm speaking Hebrew it makes my secular subject very holy, and don't think that because I'm speaking English it makes my holy subject secular. It doesn't. So even if he told them in Greek, even if he told them in Chinese, to put it in the kli sheni, he's teaching him content of halacha, and it's not allowed.
That's what they say, even thinking about.
Right, even li'arher, even to think you're not allowed to. Right? So afrushei me yusra shani. So the answer is, and it's an important answer, to separate somebody from avera, you're allowed to do anywhere. You see somebody doing something even in the bathroom or the bathhouse that's against halacha, you can say to him, you're not allowed to do that. You have to, because you're not doing it to discuss divrei Torah. You're doing it to observe mitzvot. That's a totally different story. Teda, and here's a proof. The Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, because Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Masekhet Shabbat Daf. Once there was a story with the student of Rabbi Meir. They went to the Beit HaMerchatz, they went to the bathhouse, and it was on Shabbat, at a time when you were allowed to go to the bathhouse. And he wanted to wash the floor, to clean the floor off. And he said, we don't wash the floor of the bathhouse on Shabbat. And then lasuchlo karka, and he wanted to oil the floor, to make the floor really nice. And this is a nice student. I'd like to find out what, he wanted to make it. Yeah, that's pretty serious. No, don't you use pine salt? Don't they clean the wood? Don't you clean the wood? Well, but they won't clean it. Yeah, the wood cleaner. So Amar Lo.
Murphy oil.
Murphy's oil, right? Yeah. So Amar Lo en tzachin. He said, we don't do that. We don't do that. So wait a second. So Alma Afrushe Meisur Hashane. So Hachana Afrushe Meisur Hashane. So you see from there that why did he tell him? Why did he say we don't wash the floor? We don't anoint the floor? Because he was telling him we don't do it on Shabbat. Reason is because the floors then weren't made of wood; they were made of dirt, and there was a concern that you're going to smooth out the floor. There are bumps in the floor. You're going to be improving the floor by smoothing out holes and bumps by when you're
stones.
Yeah, you're going to move it around. It's the same reason why they didn't allow sweeping in the old houses, because sweeping in the old houses, it was dirt. If there's a hole in the house, because the floor was dirt, then you'll end up filling the hole. You're doing Melachan Shabbat by sweeping. Sweeping in our houses where we don't have dirt floors, hopefully most of us don't, it's not a problem. But in those days it was. So what you see is that telling somebody a halacha, if the purpose is to separate them from violating an Aveirah, it's okay. Amar Ravina says, Shema mina b'Shabbat chayav. But you also see from this story that one who cooks in the Chamet Tiveria, in the hot springs of Tiveria, is liable for violating Shabbat, because we must assume, as Rashi explains, that this took place in the Chamet Tiveria. This first story with Rabbi took place in the Chamet Tiveria, in the hot springs of Tiveria, because that was the only place you could go for a bathhouse on Shabbat. Remember, they prohibited all the other options, so that was the only one. So it must have been Chamet Tiveria, and yet he didn't want him to put the oil into the hot springs of Tiveria. So we see that you're not allowed to do that. Because we see that the action of Rabbi was after the Gezerah. And he said to him, and he told him that even though it's the hot springs of Tiveria, so it's not. And remember, we had a discussion before whether the hot springs of Tiveria are heated by the sun or heated by Gehinom. They're heated by underneath the ground, in which case they are biblically viewed as cooking on Shabbat, or are they only rabbinically prohibited because really they're heated by the sun, and actually according to Rabbi Yosei they would be even permitted to be used for cooking on Shabbat. But you see from here that they must be biblically prohibited, because look, he's telling him don't put the oil into this hot water.
Heated by underground.
Right. That's what the rabbis say. That's why they weren't allowed. I'm sorry, that's what Rabbi Yosei said, that it was heated underground so you couldn't use it. The rabbis were saying it was heated by the sun so you could use it, right? That's what they were. I mixed it around. So that's why Rabbi Yosei explained that you can't use it because it's heated by the underground. Because he would say if it were heated by the sun you could use it. The rabbis say even if it's heated by the sun you're still not allowed to use it rabbinically, but not biblically. But the fact that you see that he was so careful here shows you he must have considered it a biblical prohibition. So, Eini, is that true? So, that really what he was telling him to do was to avoid a rabbinical prohibition. Because really cooking in the Chamet Tiveria is only rabbinically prohibited because we consider it not to be under the rubric of biblical cooking. Now, according to Rabbi Yosei, actually, it would turn out that he would say that it is biblically prohibited, perhaps, because he treated it just like something heated over the fire. But according to the rabbis, they didn't treat it that way. They treated it like something heated by the sun. Now, you don't have to necessarily interpret that scientifically, that it was heated by the sun. We know that it isn't heated by the sun. But the idea is that since it wasn't heated in the normal way that we heat water, and as part of a human cooking activity, it doesn't have the same status, and therefore it's only rabbinically prohibited. But still, he was telling him it's rabbinically prohibited. Don't put the oil into the hot springs of Tiberia to warm them. So and that's the reason why. So when he said chayav, that you're liable, he meant chayav rabbinically, that you're not allowed to do it. So Amar Rabbi Zera says, I saw that Rabbi Abba was swimming in the pool. In other words, he went into a bath and he was swimming in there on Shabbat. I don't know if he lifted his feet up or not. If he lifted his feet up, he was actually floating. Or if he just went in to wash and he kept his feet on the ground. It must be that he didn't float. Because we said that a person cannot swim in a brecha. You can't swim in a pool that's full of water.
Regardless of if it's warm or cold.
Right. Yeah, even if this pool, this is talking about a natural pool though. Even if this natural pool is in a chatzer, is in a courtyard, like a lake, you can't go into the lake on Shabbat. Even if you don't have to be concerned, for example, about carrying, because one of the issues is carrying. You're going to either carry your towel, or that when you come out, you're carrying a little water on you. Okay, so even if it's in a chatzer, it's in a place, or it's in an enclosed area, so you don't have to worry about the carrying. You still can do it. So the mikveh also, but it's indoors for the most part, right? So lo kasher, no problem. So the question is, how could he even go in? But apparently, if he kept his feet on the ground, he didn't consider it swimming. So they said, no, lo kasher, ha delet le gidudei. So one has an embankment, one doesn't have an embankment. What it means is that when you go into something which is viewed as a kli, it's viewed as an artificial entity, such as a pool that we would have today, you're not allowed to swim in a lake. You're not allowed to swim in the ocean on Shabbat. But let's say you had a pool or a mikveh that's artificially constructed for people, and therefore it has an embankment, meaning it's constructed specifically to look like a vessel. It doesn't look like a naturally occurring body of water. You're allowed to go in and to lift your feet up even and to float. And that's why mikvahot are allowed on Shabbat. Because otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to go to the mikveh. You can't go to the ocean as a mikveh on Shabbat. But you could go to a real mikveh on Shabbat, because since it's constructed as an artificial thing, it's permitted. It's distinguished from swimming in an ocean or swimming in a stream or a lake. And this is why Sfaradim basically say that just like you can go swimming, just like you can go to the mikveh, you should also be able to go to a swimming pool. Because the swimming pool is no different on Shabbat. Now there are other issues with swimming on Shabbat, whether it's the appropriate way to spend your time on Shabbat, but and that's the reason why some of the rabbis don't like it. But halachically, technically, going into a swimming pool is no different than going into a mikveh on Shabbat, and going into any naturally occurring body of water would be prohibited. And the reasons for it, there are a number of different reasons that are given for why. One is because you might kick up the dirt from the bottom of the ocean and make a hole. One is because you might end up fashioning, pulling a reed out and making a little thing to float with. There are various reasons given why you shouldn't. But if it's something which is clearly an artificial entity, you're allowed to use it. You're allowed to go into it and to immerse in it and to float in it on Shabbat. And that's the conclusion of it.